Okay, this video is dealing with inflation. Syntonomic videos, topic inflation. Definition of inflation is a general rise in the price level. Now, inflation is not about one good going up in price or another service going up in price. It's about the average price level in the economy. So a general rise in the average price level of the economy. Now, a lot of times the inflation rate is tied to the Consumer Price Index. The CPI is an indicator that comes out monthly, and it's tied to inflation. It measures the weighted average of the prices of goods and services that the typical household buys. It's referred to as a household basket of goods and services. And it's a weighted basket, meaning 10% on food, 15% on clothing, 30% on education, 40% on shelter. So it's a weighted average of the goods and services that the typical household would buy. And that's what we measure inflation by, this Consumer Price Index. Now, there's some flaws that go with this. Just like there was flaws with GDP, there's going to be flaws with the CPI. There's also going to be flaws with the unemployment indicator as well. Now, what are some flaws of the CPI? Well, as far as measuring your own inflation as a family, it says right here, you may not spend like the typical family. In class, I gave you that chart, that pie chart, that showed the percent that each household spends on different, education, food, shelter, and so forth. Well, you may not spend that percent as the typical household. So it doesn't necessarily measure your inflation. So there could be a flaw to that. And the other thing, too, is when the typical household goes to the store, and if they see fish as being expensive, they substitute it with chicken. Or if they see meat being expensive, they substitute it with fish or whatever. When some items start to become expensive, the typical household makes substitutions. When they figure out the CPI from 1 month to the next, they go to the store and they buy the same items, the same number of cans of this, the same number of jars of this, regardless of the price. So they don't account for the typical family making substitution. All right, so that could be a flaw. And then the other thing that you got to look into is too, maybe that you're paying higher prices for better products, like new and improved. We don't take that into consideration. All right? Ever hear of the cost of living adjustment? They're known as COLAs. COLAs are tied to the CPI. In other words, if you have a contract, and in your contract it says that they're going to give you a cost of living adjustment. Okay, they're going to give you a cost of living adjustment. It means at the end of the contract or towards the end of a year, they're going to go back and see how the CPI did, if it went up 1 or 2 or 3%, and they're going to increase your wage, your salary by that. Social Security payments for the elderly are tied to the CPI. Every 2 or 3 years, they go back and they figure out how prices have gone up, and then they give Social Security payments a raise, an increase. All right, so the cost of living adjustments are tied to the CPI, contracts and Social Security payments and so forth. And again, the CPI is what we use to measure inflation. Now, another indicator is called the PPI, right? The Producer Price Index. And this measures the average price level of the resources or materials used by producers. So the CPI is looking at the goods and services that the typical household buys, and the PPI is looking at the materials and resources that the producers use to make the goods. Now, the PPI is known as a leading indicator, meaning if you start to see a couple months, 2, 3, 4, 5 months of the PPI going up, what's going to happen over time is producers are going to pass that increase onto the consumer, and you'll see the CPI going up. So these are indexes. What are indexes? They measure the average price level. Well, the CPI measures the average price level of the goods and services that the typical household buys. The PPI measures it's the average price level of the materials that producers use to make the product. And then there's one called the GDP deflator. Now, the GDP deflator measures the average price level of all the goods and services that are part of GDP. And they use the GDP deflator to take, remember the formula? Nominal GDP divided by the index equals real. Well, when we're talking about nominal GDP, they divide it by this. They divide it by the GDP deflator to get the real GDP. So this is the broadest measure. It includes both the goods that are involved in the PPI and it includes the goods and services that are involved in the CPI. All right, so let's talk about how inflation affects the different markets and the players within each market and who comes up a winner and who comes up a loser. Now, these are isolated situations. In an isolated situation, you could have a winner and a loser. But in general, unanticipated inflation, we expect inflation to be about 2%. That shows good growth. Shows that people are spending money and the economy is growing. But anything above 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% means that we got some troubles along the way. And a lot of people are hurt by inflation. In general, savers are hurt because they're purchasing. They put money in the bank at 0.25% and prices go up 5, 6% in inflation. Well, they're losing purchasing power. So purchasing power gets taken away from people. Inflation is not a good thing. High inflation, okay? So we have different markets and we have the players and we have the winners and the losers. So let's talk about that. The three markets that we're going to talk about are the credit market, the product market, and the labor market. The players and the winners and the losers. So in the credit market, it's about the lender and the borrower. If you go to the bank to borrow money, you are the borrower, the bank is the lender. Now we're talking about, and the emphasis is right here, emphasis on unanticipated inflation. We expect inflation to be about 2%. So when there's unanticipated inflation, who wins, who loses? Well, the lender is the loser. The borrower is the winner. The lender is giving you money up front that has more purchasing power than when you pay it back to the lender. So the lender is giving out money that has greater purchasing power than when you pay it back. So the lender loses and the borrower wins. You are getting money up front that has more purchasing power than when you pay it back. And not only that, think about it. If I had known, if I'm the lender, and if I had known that inflation, let's say inflation is 2%. So I charge you 5% interest. So the nominal interest rate is 5% minus the inflation, 2%, and 3% is the real interest rate. Remember how we figure out nominal versus real? Remember this formula. The nominal of anything minus the inflation rate equals the real. So the nominal interest is 5%. The inflation is 2%. So the real interest is 3%. That's the real return on my money that I was expecting. When inflation goes up above 2%, it's cutting into the real interest rate for the bank. All right, so the bank is losing. The bank expecting 3% return, and when inflation goes up, they're getting less than that. Now let's say inflation was 5%. If inflation was 5%, and I knew it, and I anticipated it, the bank would have charged you 8%. The nominal being 8%, the inflation being 5%, the real return being 3%. So you sort of, as a borrower, you sort of lucked out. You were charged an interest rate that was lower because we did anticipate the inflation. So when you borrow money, and say you are the borrower, and the bank is the lender, the bank loses. The bank is giving you money that has greater purchasing power than when you pay it back. And you are temporarily winning. You are getting money up front that has greater purchasing power than you are paying it back. Okay? Now, this is an isolated situation. Remember, after this situation, you become the consumer and you go to the store and you're paying higher prices too, so you're losing out also. but we're talking about an isolated situation. And our emphasis, again, is on unanticipated inflation. Now, the product market, the producer and the consumer. Well, the producer could be, now we're talking about unanticipated inflation. If prices are going up, the producer can raise the price of his product or her product. And the producer can win that way, make more profit temporarily. But what's going to happen over time, since we have inflation, is that the cost of making the product for the producer, the suppliers are going to start charging higher prices and cut into that profit. The consumer loses. The consumer goes to the store and is losing purchasing power. So with the product market, the producer may temporarily win as long as the cost of production are fixed for a while. Once those costs of production vary and the suppliers can increase their cost to the producer, then the producer could also lose. But the consumer loses. The consumer is paying higher prices on a fixed income and is losing purchasing power. The third market is the labor market. Now, with the labor market, you have the employer versus the employee. And assuming we signed a contract. So if I sign a contract with my employer and I sign, let's say, a 3% contract increase in pay, because I thought inflation would be 2%. Okay. But inflation is 5, 6, 7%. Guess what? I lose. The employee loses because prices are rising and I'm getting a fixed income for the next year. The employer wins because to the employer, I am a fixed cost. Right? To the employer, he has to pay me a salary. We signed a contract. I am a fixed cost to that person. So I signed a contract at 3% increase and inflation went up to 5, 6, 7%. The employer temporarily wins. And the employee is going to lose. Even if I have a cost of living adjustment tied to my contract, because the cost of living adjustment is going to take into effect or come into effect at the end of the inflation. In other words, it's nice to have it in your contract. The term is you become less of a loser because at the end of the year, you get an increase in pay, but guess what happened during the year? Prices already went up, but it's better to have a COLA than not. And in general, the deal is savers, people who put money in the bank, and people on fixed incomes will lose. Inflation is bad. When it gets out of control, it is tough to rein in. All right, so we'd like to see the prices grow at a rate of 2 to 3% because that shows an economy that's growing. But when it gets out of hand, it's very tough for businesses to make future predictions of what's going to happen in the future if things are unstable, to make business decisions if things are unstable. All right. Now, in general, inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods. A lot of money in the economy. Demand outpacing supply. So we're going to be introduced to a model. And the model is right here. We have aggregate supply. Now we've had supply and demand before on a micro sense, the supply and demand of a particular good. This is the supply and demand of all goods and services. So instead of having supply, we have aggregate supply. And instead of having demand, we have aggregate demand. And where they intersect is not price and quantity, it's the price level of the economy and the output of the economy, GDP. All right, and the typical example of demand pull inflation is the 1960s. 1960s, that decade started out with slow growth. So Kennedy was trying to get a tax cut. Now the tax cut, you got to remember now, what makes up aggregate demand is this: consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, almost like GDP, right? So when they passed the tax cut, that gave people more income. And that means people started to spend more money. So consumption went up. Also in the 60s, LBJ and the Great Society had a lot of programs for the poor. And that's government spending. So not only did you have C going up, but you had government spending going up. And you got to another point too where they were spending a lot of money on the Vietnam War that people didn't know of. So you had C going up, G going up twice, and what happened was aggregate demand was pulled up. So aggregate demand increased, and when that happened, the price level went up, and you did have more output, okay? But you had inflation. So this is called demand pull inflation. It's coming from the demand side of the economy. When an economy starts to get going and it becomes overheated, and something happens to C, I, G, or X, that's going to make AD go up, and that's going to pull prices up. And that is the typical example of too many dollars chasing too few goods, demand outpacing supply. And get to know this model. We're going to be using this model a lot. Aggregate supply, the supply of all goods and services. Aggregate demand, the demand for all goods and services. Now, aggregate demand is made up of C, I, G, and X. And when something happens to any one of these, let's say if they go up, AD is going to go up. And when AD goes up, this is the result, higher prices. 1960s, demand pull inflation. You know, so people say, where does inflation come from? Well, it's too much money out there. And usually, and there's a short-term relationship between unemployment and inflation. You know, if everybody has a job and everybody's spending money, inflation's low. Unemployment's low, but you may start to see some inflation. Demand pull inflation. Now, the other type of inflation is known as cost push inflation. Now, this comes from the supply side. All right, and again, you have your model, aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And the 1970s was an example of this. In 1973, we had the oil embargo, and that resulted in oil skyrocketing overnight. We also had food famines. And food is also a cost of production for cattle and that type of industry. So prices started to go up. Costs started to go up. You know, oil is a cost of production, transportation. So when costs started to go up, prices started to go up. And when people saw prices going up, they wanted an increase in wages. And wages is another cost of production. So what fueled inflation in the 70s was the cost side, right? The cost of production started to going up with the oil embargo, and food prices went up, and then people wanted an increase in their wages. And this got out of hand. This is called prices going up, wages going up. Prices going up, wages going up. Prices going up, wages going up. The spiraling effect of inflation. This is cost push inflation. One of the determinants of aggregate supply is going to be the cost of production. And when they go up, AS shifts to the left, which results in a higher price. Now, the result of this, AS going to the left, is the worst of both worlds, because you do get the price level going up, and down here, you actually get GDP regressing. So not only do you get high inflation, but you also get high unemployment. And that was a problem in the 70s. See, normally I said that in general, and this is not a correct statement for everything, but in general, there's usually a short-term trade-off between unemployment and inflation. There's no trade-off here. Inflation is going up and so is unemployment. If you go back to this, the demand pull in this model, yeah, the price level went up, but the output went up. And that means that prices went up and unemployment went down. Well, not the case here. The case with AS shift, the cost push, is that the prices went up and output went down. People lost jobs, unemployment went up. It was a double whammy, high unemployment, high inflation. And we have something called the misery index. When you add up the unemployment and the inflation in the 70s, you had usually 12 to 15% inflation and 10% unemployment. So the misery index was in the 20s. Okay? So two types of inflation. Demand pull, 1960s. Cost push, 1970s. One is coming from the demand side. One is coming from the supply side. Now, the result of AS going to the left and leaving us with higher prices and less output. The term that we use is called stagflation. Stagflation is the result of the cost push inflation. And why do they call it, look, it's stagflation. It's a stagnant or regressing economy, GDP, and inflation, the worst of both worlds. And again, I tried to explain the think about the short-term relationship between unemployment and inflation. If people have jobs, unemployment is low, everybody's spending money, you may start to see a little bit of inflation. Okay? And if unemployment is high, people are out of work, they're not spending, inflation might be low. So they're inversely related in the short term, and that's a debatable concept, which we'll talk about. But in this particular case, they're not inversely related. They actually were two problems that existed at the same time, which was tough for fiscal and monetary policy in the 1970s, which we'll discuss later on. Okay? Some terms. Inflation, that's when the average price level goes up. Disinflation. Let's say that compared to the base year, inflation's 3%. And let's say next month, compared to the base year, inflation's 2.5%. Well, when you have less inflation, you have the term disinflation. So prices were going up 3%, and now they're going up 2.5%. The thing is, they're going up, but they're not going up as much. That term is called disinflation. Now, when prices go down from the base year, that's called deflation. Deflation we're going to get into later on when we talk about the model. Deflation is not good. Now, we've only had it since the 1930s. We've had maybe a hint of it, but deflation is not a good thing. We like to see the price level increase by about 2%. That shows steady growth. That shows that people are spending money and the economy is growing. Again, when inflation gets out of hand, that's not good. That cuts into people's purchasing power. All right? People lose purchasing power. It's a bad thing. Now, one thing I want to talk about is this thing with expectations. Inflationary expectations and how bad they can be for the economy. In the 1970s, the prices started to go up, and they continued to go up. So when inflation was 7, 8, 9%, people expected inflation to go up higher than that. And when you expect inflation to go up, you go to the bargaining table and you ask for higher wages. And those higher wages fuel higher prices in the future. So it's a spiraling effect that gets out of hand. So if you expect inflation, that fuels inflation. Remember that. Expectations fuel inflation. And that causes higher wage contracts to be signed, which causes the AS shifting to the left. So that's a very important concept. Today we expect inflation to be about 2% because we sort of have it under control. So when we go to the bargaining table, we go for raises of 2-3%. But in the 70s, that wasn't the case. Everyone expected inflation to keep on rising. Expectations fuel more inflation. And that's part of an AS thing, because everyone asked for higher wages, expecting the higher prices. And higher wages are a cost of production, which is a determinant of aggregate supply. Now let's talk a problem that we could have dealing with the CPI. Now this is pizza, haircuts, and wine. And these goods are going to be fixed no matter what month we're talking about. This is the prices in July. This is the prices in August. And this is the price in September. Now let's say we bought one pizza and had one haircut and one wine. So the quantity is fixed, 1, 1, and 1. So what did it cost me in July? $10 for a pizza, $20 for a haircut, $8 for wine. It cost me $38 in July. Then what did it cost me for one pizza, one haircut, and one wine in August. $10.50, $19.10 cost me $39.50. And in September, it cost me $38.50. So how would I find the CPI for August? Now I'm using July as the base year. So you'll take the total of all the goods and services, which we have 3, for the month of August, came out to be $39.50, and you put it over the base year, or the base month, 38, and you multiply it by 100, and you'll get 104. So the CPI going from July to August is 104. And 104 means that the price level went up 4% from July. What is the CPI for September? And again, I'm using July as the base month. So for September, it came out to be $38.50. And you put that over the base month, and you'll get 101.3. So from July to September, prices went up 1.3%. So that's calculating the CPI in this problem right here. Now, on the next page, I show you what the 104 and what the 101 mean, what I just told you. You know, for August, they have a formula here, but make it complicated. You know, if you take the 104 and compare it with the base year, over 100 and times 100, 4%. We'll just take 104 minus 100. And inflation went up 4% from July to August. Now this is a little different here. We've been comparing everything from the base month of July. What if you're comparing it from August and you're talking about September? Well, then you would take September and subtract it from August over August, since August is the base month, and you get 2.5%. So that would be the CPI based upon, or I should say the inflation rate based upon using August as the base month instead of July. So those are some problems that could be asked with inflation and calculation process. All right, so that's our inflation review for tonight. And I gave you the GDP video last night. And I'd like you to take both of these videos and outline them, a detailed outline, and you can hand that in on Monday night at 8 o'clock. All right? Have a nice evening.